There's no sound.
Yeah, I muted myself. We're gonna try and do the editor's
Oopsie.
introduction for Paul by Paul North for Karl Marx's Capital Volume One. It's a new translation. I just get on with it, and we'll see how far we get today. If we don't get to the end, we'll see how we work tomorrow, but probably with a different software, perhaps. And I hope that you all well sort of I changed the voice again today, so we'll see how this goes.
Editor's Introduction. Paul North, Marx's Anger, pp. 4666. Oh, the first edition came out to near silence, and Marx complained to Engels about one of the few reviewers. It is strange that the fellow does not sense the three fundamentally new elements of the book. According to Marx, to revise political economy and to go beyond it in significant ways, the three new elements he added demonstrated that in contrast to all former political economy, which from the very outset treats the particular fragments of surplus value with their fixed forms of rent, profit, and interest as already given, I first deal with the general form of surplus value, in which all these fragments are still undifferentiated, in solution, as it were. That the economists, without exception, have missed the simple point that if the commodity has a double character, use value and exchange value, then the labor represented by the commodity must also have a twofold character. While the bare analysis of labor without more, as in Smith, Ricardo, etc., is bound to come up everywhere against the inexplicable. This is, in fact, the whole secret of the critical conception. That for the first time wages are shown to be the irrational form in which a relation hidden behind them appears, and that this is exactly represented in the two forms of wages, time wages and piece wages. XV. You can see that the book's three fundamentally new elements were already there, hidden within existing economic discourse. Marx brings to light what the economists don't or can't see within their own discourse. 1. Within the three accepted modes of profit, there lies a single more general phenomenon, surplus value. 2. Next to political economy's theory of the commodity, there sits the whole secret of the critical conception. 3. Behind workers' wages there lies a previously unknown relationship between owners and workers, which Marx comes to call the capital relation.
I sell a hammer, I make a profit. It seems simple. But profit is not the most basic category for these phenomena. It is, rather, a version of something else. It points toward a thing held in common by the three modes of money-making. Marx calls this surplus value, developing a category that Ricardo and others had established before him but placing it in a different position. Surplus value is the general solution out of which precipitate the three specific public forms of gain that owners, landlords, and creditors, along with their dependents workers, tenants, and debtors handle every day. For Marx, the three types of gain share surplus value as their common element. It makes them what they are. To understand any one of them, then, you need a proper theory of surplus value. The first step is to stop thinking of profit, rent, and interest as separate phenomena and start thinking of them as appearances of the same thing, which is not fixed and inert but the result of a process, the valorization process. Here is an important aspect of this new element: it is processual. Political economists tended to think from results, Marx from operations carried out in time that follow certain steps and lead to certain results, which then conceal the processes it took to produce them. Profit results from a process, the process of creating surplus value, where workers work more intensely or longer, or both, than the time or intensity of work it takes to fund their wages. Surplus value as the result of a process is the first new element in the book. The second new element is an insight that political economists already had but didn't take far enough. To see the commodity as double, as a combination of use and exchange, is only part of the story. For a commodity to be double, Marx explains to Engels, the labor that makes it has to be double too. One aspect of labor makes use value, and another aspect makes exchange value, even though both labors happen at the same time, in the same factory, with the same pair of hands. A commodity is made, on one hand, and value is made, on the other. The first process Marx calls concrete labor, the second abstract labor. Capitalist production as a whole then is doubly double. It involves concrete labor making a thing that can be used and abstract labor making sure that the thing also has value. As you can see, Marx is fearless with multiplicity. He isn't afraid to look at any phenomenon and find that it is more complex, less dependable, harder to know, more contradictory, that it has one more determination than previously thought. Therefore the method, the writing of its story, has to move among multiples, to retain complexity without descending into confusion or chaos. And just as Marx had to search, for years indeed, decades to invent a mode of presentation adequate to the complexity of the subject, so readers have to learn, invent, adopt. Be taught a more complex mode of reading that keeps myriad variables, their complex relations, and the processes that produce them in play while reading. Understanding changes its meaning when reading capital. XXVI. Marx complains, as he often does. He complains in the letter to Engels that the final new element that the early reviewer fails to react to in Volume 1 is the wage form. Again, a forgotten multiplicity plagues the common understanding of wages. If you think a worker's wages represent the amount worked, think again. An employer buys a certain amount of labor power, say 8 hours worth. But then the employer receives whatever actual labor they can get out of the laborer in that time. Negotiating in advance, they pay only for the time it takes for the worker to produce the amount of money they need to survive and return to work the next day, week, and year. They pay exactly enough to reproduce workers' labor power, and not a cent more. But workers works for the length of time and at the pace that the employer needs them to in order to cover their own expenses and make a profit. It behooves the employer to get as much labor out of the laborer as they can in the time contracted, since, once the wage rate is set, they do not have to pay more. Labor paid by the piece is similar to labor paid by the hour. In both cases the employer can ratchet up the intensity of work during an hour, and the employer can also work to drive down the general cost of living and thus lower wages at the same time. Wages misrepresent the actuality of labor, because labor, when it is sold, is double. A worker sells an owner their labor power, but the owner gets the living labor or a labor power in action for the duration of work time. The output from that labor is flexible, although wages are fixed in advance. And, to add insult to injury, workers are paid much later, after the labor has been done, so that the workers, in addition to giving a percentage of their labor away to the owner for free, also lend it to the owner on a promise to be paid eventually. And so Marx discovers, building on his predecessors in the classical economic tradition, Smith and Ricardo, that the outcomes of capital, profit, rent, and interest depend on a process of surplus value creation or valorization. This process, in turn, depends on the deceptive double existence of wages. Labor power paid for but labor in action delivered. And this double existence depends on a relation, the capital relation, in which one side, the owner, owns the means of production and extorts the total labor output at a lower price than its eventual value from the other side, the worker. At the center of the capital system is a structural imbalance. This is what Marx calls the whole secret. Capital is weird. It talks about the material conditions of life, and yet it does so at times in very abstract terms. You may ask, if Marx is supposed to be a materialist, where do all these non-material factors come in, like secrets, appearances, powers, processes, and relations? How does value, which he calls a sensual supersensual thing that has ghostly objecthood, still get to be part of a materialist revolution? It doesn't, as I mentioned, at least not in the philosophical sense of materialism, which puts, not unparadoxically, physical matter higher than thought. Marx's materialism developed substantially across his working life, starting from his dissertation on the ancient Greek thinkers Democritus and Epicurus, who are traditionally understood to reduce reality to the smallest components of physical matter, to atoms. What interested Marx about atoms was not their bare physicality but the complexity and structure they assumed in groups. In his dissertation, Marx attributes to Epicurean atoms an impetus toward self-determination, self-structuring, that foreshadowed Hegel's idealism. Yet he moved beyond this as well. Soon after finishing his doctorate, he wrote some texts in reaction to Ludwig Feuerbach, who believed that what counted for human beings was sensuous experience, entities perceived with the senses. In response, Marx proposed, in notes from 1845 that Engels published 4 decades later as the Theses on Feuerbach, that materialism should change its meaning entirely. It should now mean neither the primacy of basic physical elements like atoms, nor the primacy of objects presented to human perception, but sensuous practical activity by human beings. XXVII. Some of the elements of Marx's later materialism, if we can call it that, he generally does not, are first sketched out in these theses. With regard to Feuerbach's sensuously perceiving human beings, Marx counters that human perception is only important if it is involved in practical activity. And even these instances alone are not enough to count as materialist, unless we see such practical activity, together with sensuous perception, as taking place in an ensemble of social relationships. XXVII. It is easy to see these theses now as a turning point in Marx's thought, and for that matter, in European history. In a very short space of text, Marx distances himself from Feuerbach's critique of religion, which brings the focus of human beings from the divine to the life of their own senses. Here Marx uses Feuerbach's own model of critique to distance himself from Feuerbach's conclusions, which were still too philosophical. 2 actions had to be taken, against Feuerbach and with him too, extending his critique of religion to a critique of philosophy. First, the subject of life needed to change from an abstract single-sensing individual, which only made sense in what Marx calls the bourgeois standpoint, the standpoint of all philosophy heretofore, to an active individual inextricable from a web of societal relations, and from there to a fundamentally societal human being and, further, to humanity as a whole organized into societies. Material now refers to what happens to a societal species, what must be in place order to keep its societal relations and activities alive, where all possibilities lie not in individuals but in their necessary interdependence with others. To this Marx adds a now famous codicil: it is not enough to study the material relations of society, philosophy itself has to become a practical activity. That is, although it might first analyze the societal species, it has to work to change it. XXIX. By the time he writes Capital, materialism, if we still want to call it that, means the mode of production of a particular society in a particular epoch in human history, as well as that mode's relationship to nature, to the interdependencies among the society's members, and to the processes used to reproduce itself and those relationships in perpetuity. In this societal, historical, relational, and processual materialism, the elements, such as raw materials, products, machines, food, and human bodies and minds, are subsumed into a system that operates according to a specifiable logic. Capital, the book, its 3 now published volumes plus the other texts in orbit around it, those published before Capital and those published posthumously, along with those left in manuscript, lay out the logic of these societally material relations. Unusual thought figures. You will need great powers of thought to read Capital, but the logic Marx wants you to employ doesn't reside in the mind or in a special realm accessible only to thinking. In fact, the logic that organizes societal life under the capital system is immanent to that life and accessible first and foremost in your own practices. As he writes in the Grundriss, the aim of describing the capital system is not the dialectic balancing of concepts but grasping real relations. XXX when you buy or sell something. When you go to work in the morning, when you invest in a mutual fund, when you get laid off or switch careers. When you pay an employee or stockpile money in a cash box or a bank, you act constantly with regard to the logic immanent to our form of interactions. Look no further than your everyday experiences. The main operator in the logic immanent in capital's societal relations is value, and although it is more like an idea than like a thing, it is also real. And it does have to take a sensuous form at some stage, embody itself in a commodity or in money. In your practical life you deal with it in exactly that way, as a real ideal. You try not to lose a $20 bill not because the paper is useful to you but because the powers that it represents are really represented in that currency or bank card or ledger accounting and nowhere else. Try to buy a quart of milk with a stone, and you will discover just how real the idea of money is. A kindergartner learns to use money. In order to think critically about how it works, you need a special set of thought techniques, since what appears to you when you spend $20 is not what it is but what it buys. You act as though the value were in the money, though in fact you are not thinking directly about value at all when you buy or sell or save or invest. And you definitely don't ask how the value got there in the first place. For that, the thought techniques are not at hand, and these thought techniques are the main bounty Marx intends to give you in this book. To read Capital well, you need to train your thought in new acrobatics, including the stunt where you refer always to concrete, real practices and at the same time to the ideas within them that govern them. The book is full of distinctive Marxian thought figures, which he adapts from his guiding lights, Ricardo, Hegel, his friend Engels, the utopian socialists, and literary sons like Shakespeare and Goethe, among many others. Marx borrows and bends and sometimes invents thought figures that we are not very familiar with today. One of them I have already mentioned. You have to accustom your thinking to doubles. Almost everything, he will tell you, is twofold. But there are other figures. A partial list would have to include inversion, abstraction, reification and personification, metamorphosis, circuits and circuits of circuits, overcoming limits. Tendencies among workers toward abjection and also toward cooperation, and the endless drive of the whole system to accumulate more and more of more. First of all, to read this book you should get used to doubling. Beyond commodities and wages, almost every item in the system has an unlike twin or more, since some are quadruplets. Get used to thinking each thing twice, once as this and once as that, and then get used to combining them in an uneasy marriage. For instance, commodities and labor. In order to receive their reality as two sides of one, you must make your thought duplex, and this can be uncomfortable, even vertiginous. Analytically, you think at one time commodity and at another time labor. But to stand at the critical point from which you can take in their coincidence, you have to think them both at the same time and as both the same thing and not the same thing. Marx borrows a name for this doubleness in thought, sometimes he calls it dialectical. Another Marxian name for this is double character. Yet another is contradiction. A frequent partner for all the doubling in the book is what can be called eversion, an old word for the inversion of two elements plus a logical switcheroo in which what was once the leading element falls into second place, and a previously secondary or less important element becomes the leading element. So it is with use and exchange in the capital system. In a different society, use would lead, since use is the ultimate human purpose for human-made goods. Under the spell of capital, though, the relationship everts. Use and exchange switch places and use falls into second place while exchange becomes the highest thing. use becomes exchange's minion. In addition to doubleness, you will start thinking in and about abstractions. We tend to imagine abstractions as removed from reality, as things existing only in thought or in pure logic, and as things that persist for a long time, perhaps forever, like truth or being. Can things so removed from practical existence and the courses of time help us get enough to eat or dry and secure housing? Being and truth might seem as far from food and a roof as a distant galaxy, not to mention relatively empty of contents. This is one understanding of an abstraction, as an empty, removed, but nevertheless permanent and necessary thing. Another understanding has abstraction bringing many things together but with fewer properties than those things have in reality. This or that person may work hard or slack off, may have a lot of physical force or a little, may have great stamina or hardly any. Regardless of vast differences in characteristics, they can all be categorized under the category worker, so long as they do work. An abstraction, in this sense, isolates identifying characteristics and ignores others, in order to pull together a uniform group out of a multiplicity of differences. An abstraction is absolutely indifferent to its particular specificity, but capable of all specificities, Marx says. XXXI and Marx insists that some abstractions, despite being indifferent to specificity, nevertheless play operative, practical roles in societies for very specific purposes. Capital produces particular abstractions, and those abstractions steer social relations in a particular direction. Under capital, the main abstraction governing social life is value. It certainly is removed from direct experience. You can't eat it or live in it. Yet value operates in the system, it operates the system. Value may be an abstraction of a hammer, but this abstracted quality, its value, arises in a very different way than mere abstractions of thought like truth or being. To get to value from a hammer, you do indeed have to draw away from its multiple useful characteristics and consider just one. In this case it is the characteristic common to all commodities, not just hammers, to wit, their capacity to exchange for other commodities. When put up against a bushel of wheat or a computer program for purposes of exchange, the hammerness of the hammer matters very little. On the commodity market it becomes a hammer-shaped lump of value. The process works like this. When exchanged, two commodities have their differences abstracted away and are shown to share the same minimal quality, value. To reiterate, this kind of abstraction happens in real exchanges among real actors in time and space, not merely in anyone's head. In brief, Marx seeks to name the abstractions produced by the system and to map their interconnections and effects. It is important to note that abstractions are not the primary elements of the system, its elements are always first and foremost concrete. This or that commodity, this or that laborer, this or that act of labor, this or that experience of using and consuming, this or that sale or purchase. Each of these full to the top with experienceable characteristics. In order to function, though, the system picks out certain governing practical operations that it uses to reduce the differences among things, people, and acts. It does this to make what is concretely different comparable and exchangeable. This is an important difference between the system's use of abstractions and Marx's use of abstractions in the book. The system reduces differences in order to do certain things, to facilitate circulation or to compete with other businesses, to extort more labor or to plunder the earth. The book Capital shows us the special way capital reduces differences and teaches us about the costs these practical abstractions have in our lives. Marx uses the abstractions the system creates to differentiate its processes from other social systems. He uses these abstractions critically, not positivistically. You cannot build an economics on Marx's categories. What's more, abstractions are results of concrete processes. And the difference between process and product is perhaps the most important practical abstraction in the system and the first critical abstraction to get accustomed to when reading this book. This difference comes from the system, capital. The system celebrates products and plays down processes. Ever the contrarian, Marx celebrates the processes instead. Money is a prime example of this. Money exists as a thing. You focus on getting it, keeping it, multiplying it, getting it again, and so on. It is the object of fervent activity and passion. Money, as they say, makes the world go round. As Marx shows, going round is what money itself does. If you take it out of circulation, it runs the risk of devaluing. Money as a mere thing or stockpiled money is not only illusory because it is only a marker of value, a store of value, but also because value only keeps its value in view of what further value it can set in motion. Money promises the amount of labor or commodities that can be activated that must be actually activated in order for value to persist. For this reason, money is a dangerous thing. It is a product, but if it separates itself completely from the processes of circulation and production, if it stops and sits still as a mere thing, it risks losing its power. Money should be in process as much as possible, moving from here to there, making things happen. You can look at process from a critical perspective as well. Labor is a process, but what kind? Like other processes in the capital system, it is an active sequence of steps that coordinates interactions between living human beings, using their skills and knowledge, together with nature. With its processes and products, both of which are embedded deep in a social world. Labor means expending time, materials, and energy that can never be replaced into a product that soon enters a different circuit, the circuit of exchange. Early in his writing life, Marx identified in the labor process an effect he called alienation, insofar as in capitalistic labor, a product made by one person would be taken away and used to benefit someone else, not the worker but an owner who did not participate directly in making the product. Later in Capital, Marx identifies something else in this process, a new critical name for the process itself, an abstraction that he makes for critical purposes, looking at the concrete labor process, which he calls reification. With this word he names the way that, in the capital system, processes get rolled up and congealed in things. So we have to learn to think not only the superiority of processes over products, but also the self-concealing nature of capital processes, where products hide the actions that originally went into making them. We also have to learn to think processes that the capital system doesn't yet have names for, like reification, which Marx himself names and which is the process by which a capitalistic process conceals its life in a dead thing. A companion process to reification is personification. Marx makes a lot of this one. He uses personification for critical and comic effect throughout this volume, although personification, as with other abstractions like reification, also originates in the system. It is not just a quirk of Marx's literary style. Processes result in and appear as things, which is what Marx calls reification. And things take on the characteristics of people. A commodity carries its owner to market, despite the fact that the owner, as Marx says in the first line of chapter 2, has to physically carry the product. At the same time, even more strangely, human beings, who were previously the model for personhood, become representatives of commodities, and thus they are persons in a specific way. They personify economic relations. One giant personified being dominates the system, and that is capital itself, which acts like the only sovereign individual in the world, pulling human beings' strings, putting them into relations, and directing processes and manipulating products within its sphere of influence. The big personification, capital, alongside the little personifications, commodities, and people too, as bearers of economic relations rather than, say, as moral or legal or psychological persons, start to blend into another critical use of personification. Where capital makes commodities into persons, Marx, in order to point this up, has commodities speak in the text as though they were indeed people. He also makes functional roles speak, such as the capitalist and the laborer. Further, in his depiction of the system, He frequently uses personifying adjectives and verbs to describe the system's processes. Labor can be living or dead. Capital thinks and wills, travels, and sets up house. In response to a stupid assumption by a political economist, Marx retorts, "We know what capital will say to that. XXXII. Capital doubles, everts, abstracts, reifies, and personifies. If you learn to think in doubles, in eversions, in abstractions, to work backward from reifications and personifications to the processes and historical human beings involved in them, you are on your way to understanding the system in which you live." But, you might get the sense from this that capital exists in a set of stationary categories. That there are ways in which it always is. The situation is even more confounding because, by value in motion, Marx does not mean only that value travels from here to there. It regularly also changes its form. Value moves and transforms, and its change of form is necessary for the system to function. Therefore, a change of thought is necessary to understand it. Learn to think in transformational relays, where what was a commodity is now money and what was money is now a commodity again in Marx's famous formulas, C, M, C and M, C, M. Formulas they may be, but they represent real circuits of transformation. Raw materials metamorphose into finished commodities, and an opposite process gets some attention here too, though more so in Volume 2, where products, especially means of production, slowly wear away or get used up in production and consumption. Wearing out is one type of consumption, another transformation that value undergoes. Neither arbitrary nor sporadic, transformations happen continually in the system. From the perspective of production, for example, capital starts as commodities, in the form of raw materials, becomes a finished commodity that is traded for money, which then travels to production again, back in the hands of the original producer, to become, once again, commodities as raw materials. Metamorphic circuits proceed in cycles, and smaller cycles intersect to make bigger rounds of production, as all circuits reproduce themselves each year. Volume 2 gives all the details about these circuits of transformation. Volume 1 introduces the ultimate motivator for the circuits and their revolving movement. They move, it all moves because capital wants to increase. Because of forces only hinted at in this Volume 1, of the main forces being competition, which is treated more directly in the posthumously constituted Volume 3, but also because of the ongoing and changing needs of any business and economic sector. Capital in total has to continually grow. Each capitalist has an independent drive toward accumulation, and the system as a whole is shaped not like a circle but like a spiral. Around go the circuits in one motion, widening go the circuits in another. This is partly because, the more a capitalist accumulates, the more they are able to accumulate. And so, on one side, the relations among classes, between kinds of actors, owners, producers, merchants, financiers, bankers, transporters, communications workers, and so forth among sectors, between economic institutions and the state that supports and protects them. All these relations need to be reproduced year after year without major breaks for all the actors to receive their livelihoods and for the businesses to stay in business. Marx asks you on one level to think in cycles that over time serve reproduction. On another level, capital necessarily goes through what we most often call growth, or what Marx calls expansion. He asks you furthermore to think in widening circles, in spirals, where production that needs to be reproduced adds more and more of more. Then it becomes important to think where the more comes from. Our beast has a giant gullet, sucking into its maw previous societal forms, serfs, landowners, capitalists too of course, and raw materials. Fruits of the earth that often have to be wrested from it by force, as well as the intellectual capacities of whole societies and epochs. When it needs to grow, where does it find more to suck in? Capital is relentlessly creative in finding the more it wants and needs to make the more of more it can't live without. It finds it in the productivity of workers, through inventing machines that speed up and intensify their work. It imperializes and colonizes land, goods, and peoples. It draws into the workforce previously unemployed populations in Marx's mid-19th century milieu. This included women and children, who had not entered the industrial labor marketplace before in any numbers. Now it draws into the workforce people who previously existed in different societal systems, as subsistence farmers or in other modes, where they still exist. It is also true that the system sucks in not only new materials, labor, and land, on the production side, but also markets and consumers, without which it could not realize its more of capital. In the middle chapters of Volume 1, to think the way capital overruns whatever limits are placed on it. When workers in 19th century England collectively fought back against long workdays of 10, 12, 14, and more hours, and when they won with legislation prohibiting long workdays, factory owners fought back by wringing more labor out of them in shorter times through intensification and other productivity increases. Such a beast crashes through, sidles around, or digs underneath any limit set before it. Perhaps the hardest thing to get used to in capital is one thought figure. It is related to the doubling that happens all over the system in the book. Nowhere really does Marx condemn the capital system or call for revolution. That would be futile, maybe even silly. The system was taking over the world, and you would play right into its own personifying gesture to judge it as though it were a thinking, willing agent, like a sovereign state that could be countered with force. It is not one, it is an aggregate of actors and processes that together, despite the contingency of any particular deal, always works out in favor of the system. At only one point in the book does Marx recall his earlier revolutionary anger and evoke a future where capitalists, who had expropriated land and labor, get paid back in kind. The expropriators will be, he says, expropriated by a liberated and educated mass of workers. Despite this remnant of a manifesto, this cry for a future in which the whole system will have been overturned and turned into something better for everyone. The overwhelming mood of the book is ambivalence, another kind of double. Ambivalence is the double attitude Marx adopts toward the behemoth, which had become, in his mind, a largely immovable fact.
Can't hear anything.
Oh, good. No one could hear the garbage I was producing. Anyway, we'll try and produce more of this tomorrow, either in the same form or we will look at alternative means of approaching the problem. The other thing I wanted to introduce is perhaps Fuchs's approach to how you read volume one of Marx's Capital, which I may start doing only because it does make the connection between certain new concepts like eversion, um, uh, and not a new concept, but reification, about re-emphasizing some of the basic concepts that Marx has introduced, and that North emphasizes, because what North is doing is consolidating a variety of approaches to Marx's Capital. That I mean, in this particular preface and in the next one, although the next one's more technical, um, the the kind of accumulated sets of post-war interpretations of Marx's Capital are sort of being incorporated here, and I think this is a useful, because I think the explanation, for example, of doubles, which has a street name as well, the doubles, but it is more about trying to think about dialectical or paired dyadic relations, which cut across a variety of ideas. So that's what I'm hoping it'll do. Are there any questions or comments? Um, Hearing none, I will